Well, hi, everybody. This is Joffrey Swait. Welcome back to our Kepler Lives, all these chats that we've been having with our wonderful teachers. And today we have Mrs. Helen Howell. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you very much. Thanks for doing the interview.
Yeah, I've been having a ton of fun with these, and I've been looking forward to this because, your profile is full of zest and energy.
Oh,
Um,
good.
and full of zest and energy about being a librarian. So that's going to be something I'm going to want to unpack
Yes.
in short order. But actually, I wonder if you would share with us a little bit about yourself, your family, where you live, and maybe how you heard about Kepler.
Sure. So I live in Moscow, Idaho. I'm married to Caleb. We've been for 9 years almost, end of this month. We've got a 2-year-old girl who is the sunshine of our lives. And I have been a librarian for about 17 years. I graduated from New St. Andrews College in 2006 with my BA, and then I really missed the books and the people, so I came back. My husband and I did our master's degrees together at NSA. We graduated in 2016.
Okay.
I've been the librarian at New St. Andrews College since then.
So let's talk about you being a librarian because,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a bookish person. I've owned a bookstore. I love books. I love books for themselves. I mean,
Yes.
I love reading books, but I also just, I love books that I haven't read and just having books
Yes.
around and the smell of books, all that. I get it.
Yes.
But there's something that's a little edgier about being a librarian. So,
That's not an adjective I usually hear associated with librarian.
Exactly. But so did you always want to be a librarian? I say always. Was it an ambition of yours to be a librarian, or did you kind of fall into it?
Yeah, no, I've wanted to be a librarian since I was a 4-year-old girl and I learned to read.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
So how did you go about pursuing that? Because one of the things you're doing at Kepler is you'll probably this coming year be helping seniors with their senior theses and doing research.
Yes.
And currently, as a librarian, you help college students
Yes.
with research.
Yes.
So what do you do as a librarian?
Well, it depends on the kind of library you work in. I've worked in public libraries and in academic libraries. I've loved them both. But really, I think my favorite thing about being a librarian, the books are great. The books are fun. The books are one of the best things. But really, it's being able to connect people with the books that I know that they need.
Okay.
Connecting students with something I know they'll love or something I know that they need for a project that they're doing. Being able to help people find the information and the joy in whatever books that I know that they need for whatever project they're working on. That really is my favorite part of being a librarian. And you can't really get that just from reading or from hanging out in bookstores, although I love doing both of those things also. I also will just go into bookstores and just smell the books. It's great.
Right. And, I think I've had a little, you mentioned sniffing the books. I think I've had a little scent of what you're talking about when you do find when someone comes in with a particular urge, but no particular title in mind.
Yeah.
And I, as a bookseller, was able to connect them to that. But there is something a little more relational about a librarian and a kid's librarian, but also like a librarian in a college situation. It's I think it's understood. I guess the way I might compare it is you have a police detective, someone who's you whether you know him or not, like you assume that he's an expert in police work, but then you have the patrolman, and that's the person you tell the kid when you need help, talk to the policeman.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's where a librarian is that person. That's the book person who will help you. It almost seems more relational. Is this jiving with your experience? Am I just making this up? Oh, you're frozen. Hi, are you there? Oh, no. Technical issues. Well, I'm going to kick her out of the stream and then hopefully bring her back in. Oh, sad. Okay, well, we will see if Mrs. Howell is able to pop back in. Hi, Sarah. Welcome. Libraries and librarians are awesome. Yes, absolutely. And one of the people I was thinking about as Mrs. Howell was talking was a woman named Carrie, who she actually was. She hung out at our bookstore and led a bunch of people in our bookstore through a whole gaming campaign. She was a librarian, and when my kids were little, she was their first librarian, and that relationship was really very cool. Hi,
There
Helen, you're back.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
It told me my Wi-Fi was not happy with me.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're back. Yeah, so I was in the middle of a long excursion comparing librarians to police officers. Did you pick up any of that?
Yes, and it reminded me of one of my favorite Neil Gaiman quotes as he says, Google can bring you back millions of right answers, but a librarian can bring you back the right one.
Perfect. Yeah, so you wanted to be a librarian from the age of 4, and then so you pursued your education. So you got your bachelor's, went away, missed books, came back. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I graduated in 2010. I had been working in the NSA library just as a student worker. And then so I got engaged right after graduation. We had to wait a year to get married, and then we had to wait a year for my husband to finish his bachelor's degree. And we knew that we wanted to go somewhere for grad school. We applied a couple different places, but NSA, I just loved the professors there, and I already had a lot of friends up here. Caleb had already, he was pretty familiar with some of the crowd up here and some of the things that was going on. And honestly, it's still the thing that I loved about NSA the first time I came out here was the book list. A lot of people come to NSA because they come out for the student, prospective student weekends or something. I came to NSA because I saw the book list and I was like, those are the books I want to be reading for the next 4 years.
That was actually exactly the thing that attracted me to NSA, many years ago. So that's New St. Andrews College, for those of you who are unaware of what NSA is, here in Moscow, Idaho. So you're a college librarian. That probably doesn't give you very much time on target with one of your favorite things, young adult literature. And we're here today to talk about young adult books. Do you get to talk about kids series with a lot of your college students?
Kind of on an underground basis.
Secret meetings, got it.
Yeah, I'll walk up on a group of people who are furtively talking about whatever young adult series, and I'll have to kind of break into that.
You're supposed to be reading a 2,000-page tome,
right?
Not reading. Yeah, okay, got it. Well, across the bottom of the screen right now, we have some of Mrs. Howell's favorite kids literature, young adult literature. But before we talk about all the good stuff, we put a provocative title on this stream, which was the Black Hole of Young Adult Literature. Talk about the state of young adult literature today, please.
Yeah. So to kind of get a handle on that, you kind of need to know where young adult literature came from. And honestly, it's kind of funny. It's only been a series as long as teenagers have kind of been a separate class of people. So back in the 30s and 40s, right after the Great Depression, is when the advertisers figured out there was a whole separate group of young people who were all flooding back into the high schools, who were kind of a separate market now from the adults and the children. And so they started thinking about ways to market different things to them. The books didn't really catch up until the 60s or so. First books that were recognized, the first books that were called young adult books were, one of them was called The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, and it was the first book published in this genre that had, I guess it's not a genre, a category, that had been written by a teenager for teenagers to read, and it had a teenager as the protagonist. And it was very, very different from the kind of stuff that had been read by young adults before. Before that, it had been pretty genre, like light romances or possibly horror stories. And this was the first book that felt a lot more realistic. It was kind of gritty. It was a story of two conflicting teenage gangs in the streets of Tulsa. It just had a very different feel to it, and teenagers could relate to it a lot more. So after that, books started being written specifically for the young adults. And in the 70s, there was a lot of kind of gritty stuff, or stuff that was like exploring your identity. And a lot of it was, I haven't really come across a ton of that. That was really great. But also, that's about the time that Madeleine L'Engle became a big deal in the 70s. The 80s, you had all of the endless series of things like Sweet Valley High and the Bobbsey Twins and Animorphs and Goosebumps and like all of the things that were 150 books a series. And a lot of that was hack writing. I actually remember being a little kid in the libraries, and my mom would tell me to open up the book and see if it said that it was written by or if it was created by. And if it said by, then I would know that it was hack writing written by some committee somewhere. And I actually was not allowed to read the hack writing.
Well, that was one of the great disillusionments of my childhood, when I realized that the Hardy Boys weren't all written by the same person.
Yeah.
It broke my little heart.
Yeah. I know. I think there was a total of maybe 3 or 4 Bobbsey Twins books that I could read, and a couple of other things, but most of it was pretty formulaic stuff until the 90s, and we got Harry Potter in the 90s. And Harry Potter is really the book that changed the whole landscape of young adult literature. It was the first book that became a worldwide global event, kind of like when a blockbuster movie comes up and everyone's in costume and everyone's lining the streets outside the bookstores and camping out on the, on the sidewalks and things. So Rowling really expanded the market for young adult literature in ways that nobody had ever done before.
Yeah.
And after that, so there are basically 3 series that kind of set the stage for where we are in modern young adult literature. It was Harry Potter, and then Twilight, and then The Hunger Games. And those 3 came really hard on each other's heels. Twilight came out right about the time Harry Potter ended, and then Hunger Games came out not long after that. And I think since then, because those 3 series have really expanded the market to the extent where it's even the people who are reading the books, young adult has come to mean anybody from the ages of 10 to all the way up to 25. So it's, those 3 books have kind of made it possible for people, authors who would not normally have had an audience or had a much smaller audience, to get their work out and actually be seen by a lot of people. So we're actually glutted right now. It's also the reason why we're glutted in the YA market with all the ripoffs of all of the series, all the vampire series that are everywhere.
Right.
And the Divergent series was just basically a Hunger Games ripoff. The Maze Runner is a Hunger Games
ripoff.
So a lot of what's coming out now is either pretty obviously imitating one of those 3 series, or it's stuff that maybe would not normally have gotten through the publishing process, but because there's such a huge demand now, it can.
Right.
So that's kind of like the background to that.
Okay. I have kind of a little side question before we, dive further into the darkness of the state of young adult literature. Because what is young adult literature? And I'll go with two different sides of it. So one of our favorite authors as a family is N.D. Wilson,
Yes.
and N.D. Wilson's books at our local library in South Carolina, when we lived there, were categorized as children's literature.
Yeah.
And at that time, our kids were allowed to get any book they wanted to from children's books. As they got a little older, we opened up for a couple of them. They can get any book they want to out of the adult section. The only section of the library that was barred to them, where they had to ask permission for every title they would check out, was the young adult section.
Yeah.
Because there was just really awful content for kids, inappropriate content for kids.
Yes.
It's wrapped into so many of these YA titles, but wrapped in a way where it was hard for the kids to recognize that it was coming. On the other side of things, you have books like The Fault in Our Stars, where there are sort of, because you mentioned young adult is stretching all the way out to 25 now in literary. So, a book like that has literary pretensions.
Yeah.
Right. It's not, no one thinks The Maze Runner is great literature, not even the people writing it. Right. With a positive angle on it, it's just supposed to be a fun adventure story.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
But something like The Fault in Our Stars, definitely is trying to do more, and yet is clearly directed at young adults. It's not supposed to be an easy read for adults.
Right.
It's YA.
Right.
So what is young adult literature? And I wonder if you could comment on some of what I brought up.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess the clinical definition would be books that are usually fiction, but not always, written for an audience between 12 to 18. That's usually the age range of the protagonists in the novels.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people will say it's a genre, but it's not actually a genre. It's just a category, kind of an age category. And within that, you can have fiction, you can have fantasy, you can have horror, you can have romance, all the normal genres, but it's just geared toward a particular age range of consumers. And I have noticed a lot of the same things that you're talking about, and I guess we'll get into this in a minute, but there's also a weird thing that's happening in YA lit, especially between authors, where publishers are pushing this and authors are pushing each other to do this, where there's this push to be politically correct. The SJW stuff has really kind of penetrated the YA market in a lot of ways. And so you have authors having really weird backstabby wars on Twitter about each other's books. There's a lot of stuff about, regardless of how trashy the book actually is, you'll have readers who don't understand what the author is trying to do, and they'll label each other as racist or as homophobic or as whatever. Like, you don't have enough diversity in your novel. Why don't you have a Black protagonist? Or this book is clearly racist, or this book is clearly, sometimes even before they've read the book, they'll just read the dust jacket description and be like, this book triggered me. I can't believe that this is being published. And they'll run boycotts on each other's publishers and stuff. So there's a lot of push in that community to be including certain kinds of characters and certain kinds of stories that will feed the narrative that the publishers want to be pushing at.
I think the Percy Jackson series is a great example of that momentum.
Yeah. To be honest, I have only kind of skimmed a couple of the Percy Jacksons. It wasn't one of those books that I found particularly.
You've done well, Mrs. Howell.
Yes. Sometimes I'll read it for the sake of copiousness, and other times I'll just think,
yeah. Well, it's interesting because several years ago I was working with a bunch of fifth graders, and every single boy I worked with had their nose, and it didn't matter, the jocks, everybody had their noses in these books.
Yes.
I definitely took a gander.
Yeah, they're a big deal. And And actually, it's been funny. Sometimes, even if it is, well, okay, even the super popular stuff, the Hunger Games, the Twilight, the Harry Potter, I would say all of those series have issues that readers should be aware of. And it's funny to me that you will have highly intelligent young people, college students that I have worked with, who I know personally, who are wonderful, wonderful, highly intelligent people who are capable of explaining Plato's Republic to you. And I find out that secretly they love the Twilight series and are massively obsessed.
Mm.
It's funny to see that disconnect for people. And I
Yeah,
think,
well, I think there's just it's a question of category, right?
yes, yeah, yeah. And people, for some reason, they turn off their mental switches when it comes to what they're entertained by.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
if they would watch movies or read books for fun, that if it was something that they were reading in class, like they can point out all of the problems with Plato's philosophy. They can identify all of his worldview issues. And then suddenly when it's just, oh, I just want to watch a fun show on Netflix, that part of their brain just switches off and they become very passive consumers of whatever it is that's being fed to them.
So let's talk about that because are you saying that I should be eating filet mignon all the time?
No. Macaroni and cheese is perfectly acceptable, but there's a difference between macaroni and cheese and then just straight up poison. And a lot of the times it's like mixed together in
Yeah.
such a way that it's hard to fill.
And there's even a difference between Kraft mac and cheese and the mac and cheese that mom makes,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
And no one is going to say that either of those is better for you than hand rolled whole grain noodles with
Yeah.
you killed
Yeah.
the cow yourself to make the bolognese, right? I mean, but
Right.
there's
Right.
definitely a difference between Kraft mac and cheese and your mom's mac and cheese.
Yeah,
Unless your mom makes
absolutely.
Kraft, which we're not. It's cool.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And you can't expect everything you read to be filet mignon. That's impossible. But you do have to recognize, especially with fiction, and this is something that um, a lot of people haven't worked through, is that fiction especially is a vehicle for so much kind of intuitive and emotional growth. There are um, people are hungry mentally, and the fiction will feed you and it will try to shape you in certain ways. They've even done studies where uh, they've figured out that, say, if you're reading, and it's because you put yourself in the place of the protagonist when you read. And if you read about the protagonist or the characters in the books running, the parts of your brain that deal with running will light up as if you were running yourself. Like you are literally putting yourself in the place of the protagonist and learning about things through the protagonist's eyes. And if what the protagonist is doing is somehow questionable, your capacity for, well, basically your conscience gets pretty numb pretty quickly. If you're just working through, say, like, the protagonist in the Hunger Games, Katniss, where we sign on with her because she sacrifices herself for her sister. And then because the stakes are so high and because we like her already, we're drawn into this bloodbath with her and we're expected to say, because the stakes are so high, it's okay for her to do whatever she has to do to save her family, to save herself, all of that stuff. And the fact that we're following her so closely means that we're learning what she's learning and becoming that kind of person. And if you're not watching for that, if you're not leaning against the things that are trying to shape you on that kind of intuitive level, it's really hard to maintain your ability to judge things properly, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think that's become more and more a predominant part of storytelling these days, which is the likability factor. Since we
Yeah.
all admit that everything is morally relative, there'll even be stories where everyone knows that everyone in it is technically a bad guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
including the 14-year-old reading it, or it's a TV show, and but we were introduced to this person first, and they're more likable than everyone else, and that's enough,
Yeah.
right? Because really, that's how we lead our lives now. Right? There
Yeah.
is no true goodness, true beauty.
Right.
There's
It's
no
how you
truth.
feel about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
so a good storyteller will then really work likability more than anything else. So,
Yes.
why, like, what's happening with young adult literature where we have, like you said, still like 25-year-olds still being targeted, where I can't let my high schoolers into young adult, into that area, but I can let them roam the bookshelves of a public library in the adult section.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
how has that happened? What is the industry trying to do? What are writers trying to do that's made it that way?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm sure I don't have all of the pieces to the answer, but some of it is the SJW agenda, where they're pushing certain narratives onto this particular audience. Um, some of it is kind of related to that. Just young adult literature is always coming of age literature. It's where the protagonists are figuring out what their identity is and what kind of person they're going to be, what kind of choices they're going to make. And that's a prime target for people who are trying to tell them um, that they can choose to be whatever they want to be. They can, and that relates a lot to a lot of the sexual themes that are cropping up and all of just the truly graphic, horrible trash that's now prevalent in young adult literature, where they're
Truly graphic, y'all. If you guys don't know, it's just as well, but truly
yeah,
graphic. Young adult
yes,
literature, you can't. Yeah, well, I'll
horrifying.
please proceed.
No, no, it's horrifying. I've dipped in a couple of times recently into a couple new series, and I was shocked. Like,
Yeah,
you're right. It was much worse than what I had seen in adult literature. And that's not great. But, uh, so part of it is them trying to push this agenda on young adults that their sexual identity, their moral identity, all of this stuff is up for grabs, and they are free to, and they should explore it, and make sure they've exhausted every possible avenue before they make their decision,
right.
um, which is horrifying. Um, and sometimes it's almost always wrapped up in this. They don't just come right out and say that. It's wrapped up in what could be an appealing story without all the trash. So that people are willing to follow the characters into that and become those protagonists and actually try all these things out by proxy.
Right.
Yeah, it's a bad situation.
Yeah, and it's very brutal as well. I mean, I
Yeah.
suppose it's for young adults, so there's no thought to giving the propaganda any subtlety. But at the same time, we open ourselves up a little more, because I mean, in the age I grew up, and I'm still conditioned, even after 15 years of raising kids, to think more openly and more softly about young adult literature.
Mhm.
So I keep getting surprised.
I know.
What is going on?
I
Well,
know.
I wonder. So I have a daughter. She's 16 years old, loves
Mhm.
to write, and just constantly dabbling and messing about, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and so if she were to say, oh, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a story.
Mhm.
What would you tell her you would want to read? Like, what should these young adult books be doing?
Yeah. That's a great question. And the books that I love in YA literature are kind of a good answer to that. One of the books that didn't make it onto the list, that was just published this last winter, was Christine Cohen's The Winter King, uh,
Hmm.
which is just a lovely, lovely book. And one of the striking things about it for me reading that was how it is an answer to a lot of the things in a book like The Hunger Games, because the protagonists are the same age. They have a lot of the same dilemmas, a lot of the same tensions. They're both trying to save their families from starvation. They're both
Hmm.
trying to expose a corrupt system. But where Hunger Games does it basically by having Katniss become part of the system in order to expose the system, which doesn't really work on a metaphysical level. The protagonist in The Winter King, Cora, is able to expose the system for what it is and also realize what the system ought to be. She's able to recognize the corruption and then is able to see when it's presented to her. This is she doesn't throw out the entire thing. She, instead of inciting rebellion and a whole bloodbath, she's able to say, okay, this was false religion, but over here I can see what the true religion is supposed to be. And she's able to set in the place of the false religion without all of the angst and the horror that Katniss has to go through in the Hunger Games. So in spite of the similarities between the books, The Winter King is a much more wholesome answer to that. So I would tell your daughter, find the books that really are lovely and worthwhile in the category, I guess. They do exist.
Yes.
They're hard. And I think it's hard to find because the authors themselves have to push against so much of what the publishers are trying to get them to do with their series.
Right.
It's just hard for an author, a Christian author especially, to get a Christian story told and have it remain intact by the time it gets through the publishing process.
Right.
They are out there. So Madeline L'Engle is great. Andrew Peterson, Nate Wilson, Megan Whalen Turner, and there are others. If a young adult has the discernment, has been trained to kind of lean against that shaping that we've been talking about, there are other books that are worth reading as long as you can identify where they're trying to push you and say, I don't want to go there. I can appreciate like the craft of this, or I can appreciate the plot, or I can appreciate how well done this was, even if I don't want to go to the destination where it's trying to take me.
Which is what we as adults reading fiction end up doing often anyway.
Right. And that's a skill. That's a skill that has to be developed.
And it has to be taken seriously as a skill. Like we need to be trained to read, which doesn't mean phonetics, right? It means the ability to critique. So, you're mentioning, goodness and good books. Daniel Pukashan shares a C.S. Lewis quote in our comment section. But in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like a night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do.
It's a great quote.
It is a great quote. So you brought up in your explanation to my daughter, you brought up a great word that was part of the problem with the Hunger Games, which was metaphysical. Right? There's no metaphysics behind, like, so the Winter King.
The Winter King, yes.
Right. Christine Cohen, is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So you compared those two, and basically what you were saying was that there was no meaning behind the universe that Katniss Everdeen lives in.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So ultimately, whether she's being portrayed as good or simply likable because we met her first, or whatever it might be, everyone reading the book accepts the idea that there is no metaphysics informing the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they just don't have. Suzanne Collins is a great writer, just as far as technical craft goes. She doesn't have the same kinds of problems that somebody like Stephanie Meyer does, for instance, where Twilight is just badly written on a number of levels. She was a journalist for a long time. She really knows how to capture an audience's attention. She's really good on the level of craft, but she does not craft her world in such a way that it has a moral compass. There's no, you start off understanding that Katniss was sacrificial and a hero in putting herself in her sister's place. But then it devolves immediately into this killer be killed, survival of the fittest, Darwinist machine,
Mhm.
where it's like the moral compass has just been completely abandoned. It's totally fine to kill a 12-year-old girl because otherwise she might kill you. Like there's she's just abandoned all of her attempts at that. But then it's funny because she still tries to.
Let's see what we can do about this. Okay, hopefully she'll come back in and be able to finish up our wonderful discussion. So The Winter King by Christine Cohen actually was published, I think, last year, perhaps the year before, by Canon Press. And she recently did a writing seminar, which is available right now online. So if you look on Canon Press, you'll be able to find her writing webinar.
Oh, apologies.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. So you were talking about the moral world of
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah. So she goes from there is obviously good and evil when Katniss sur- sacrifices herself for her sister, but then it is suspended for the Hunger Games. But then also that tension is supposed to be what drives the story toward Katniss taking down the evil system. So she's still trying to say there is good and evil. There's still the Capitol is still bad because of all of these things, but Katniss is good because she's trying to take down the bad, even though she's already participated in this Darwinistic murder fest. It's just very confused and not consistent at all. So that's the main problem with the Hunger Games. And I know there are people who argue differently about all of the Christian symbolism and things in there. I think that's just being a little over generous with it.
Yeah, and certainly I think that it's interesting how Christians reacted so vociferously, say against Philip Pullman's stuff, where he's openly anti-Christ and writes stories that are full of symbolism that make it clear there's no getting around it, right? So Philip Pullman stands up and says, "I hate God, my stories hate God." Okay, so we're very aware and tuned into that. But then you have something like the Hunger Games, which is, we think that because it doesn't have this aggressive, like just I'm creating a world where God doesn't exist, and it's at least, without saying one is more dangerous than the other, why do we let down our critical radar? It's because it's not giving off the antichrist. And the using that term is going to set off all sorts of weird, but I just mean anti-Christian reactions.
Yeah, I don't know the full answer to that either. Why we've just been trained to let down our radar, but part of it is that is how we've been trained to consume things for entertainment. That's how it's been marketed to us. That's how we're expected to ingest it, is just thoughtlessly. And it's the same problem with movies, where if you ask somebody who is used to just vegging out in front of a movie, if you ask them to start kind of parsing what they just watched, oftentimes the all that they're capable of doing is saying, like, if you take a young adult to a movie, or a group of teenagers to a movie, and they come out, what they'll say is stuff like, "Oh man, the music was so great. That one line was so funny." And if you ask them, "Well, did you like it?" They say yes or no, but they won't have a reason for it, and it's because they've just been trained to consume. We're
Right.
That's how it's been marketed to us. And also that's kind of how our brains naturally work. We don't like to work hard, especially when we think we're supposed to be having fun.
Right. Yes.
So
I think you have to learn to have fun that way. If we go back
yes,
to our
exactly.
food our little food comparison.
Yeah.
It's if you never learn how to cook,
Yeah.
your appreciation for good food is just stays stagnant.
Yes.
If you learn how to cook, you learn to enjoy things high and low. You know what goes
Yes.
into it. And
Yes.
so I think that one of the things that will make us good readers is learning to be writers. Maybe not the
Yeah.
greatest writers ever, but learning to
Yeah.
write.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And it's more work that way. It's you can't just sit back and veg out in front of Netflix, but it's infinitely more fruitful and infinitely more enjoyable once you've gotten past that first hurdle of adjusting how you watch something or adjusting how you read something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for those of you who are watching, we've just been having a ton of fun talking about young adult literature and the pitfalls and joys thereof. Now would be a great time for you guys to leave some comments, maybe asking about what some of the favorite series might be, about some of the stuff that we've been talking about. So great time to pop in with some questions. Scott Postma has a comment for us. Perhaps I missed it, but you've been discussing more contemporary YA literature, and earlier you mentioned specifically Bildungsroman literature. Can you speak to the value or danger of older, or what some might consider more classical YA? He mentions The Outsiders, which we had
Mhm.
talked about,
Mhm.
or Catcher in the Rye. So can
Sure.
you speak to the value or danger of older, what some might consider more classical YA?
Sure. And I'll admit right up front that I'm not as personally familiar with some of that stuff. I have read at least parts of The Outsiders and some of the other early 70s stuff, the Judy Blume. The thing that I am hesitant about with those is if you consider especially the time when they were published, 60s and 70s, it was the time of a whole bunch of shenanigans culturally. And a lot of that shows up uh, in the literature. So the Judy Blume books, for instance, everyone it's regarded as a classic, like the Dear God, It's Me, Margaret, or something like that. Dear God, Are You There? It's Me, Margaret. Um, and it's basically just a book about a girl discovering her sexual identity or something like that. Um, it's definitely very different from kind of the genre light romances before that period, where it was like the biggest problem was who was going to take you to the prom. That was the tension in the book. Who was going to take you to prom? What dress were you going to wear? So it resonated a lot more with girls who were, struggling with certain things, but it's not literature that's going to feed somebody's soul. It's not something that's going to encourage you, inspire you toward beautiful things necessarily. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there may be exceptions to that. Like I said, I haven't personally done a survey of the early young adult literature, but there's such an opportunity with an age range like this, the coming of age literature, to inspire young people, to put them in the place of a protagonist who makes difficult, even a flawed protagonist who makes difficult choices and um, winds up choosing the right things for the right reasons. And so seldom does that happen. It does make the good ones stand out more, though.
Yeah. I wonder if you have any recommendations you would give us, for young adults
Mhm.
that were written in the 19th century, first half of the 20th.
Hmm. Uh, so early 1900s. The thing is, before the Great Depression and before this kind of influx of this class of people known as teenagers, there really wasn't quote unquote young adult literature.
Mm-hmm.
There were children and there were adults, and you were an adult as soon as you were able to work. um, and so they're basically the teenagers, the young adults read adult books. They were reading the same things that the grown-ups were reading, maybe just with a slightly uh, less trained understanding of it. So I don't really know of much from before that era. Um,
So you would categorize things like, say, the Tarzan books
sure.
as it's adult literature, fluffier adult literature, tending
Yeah,
towards the penny dreadful that a lot of
sure.
kids just glommed onto.
Yeah, I think so. Some of it was actually geared more toward kids, and the adults were like, "I love this. Let's like." It became a huge phenomenon. Um, but there isn't stuff that was written with teenage protagonists wasn't really a huge thing until later.
Yeah.
So I could just
Right.
recommend
That is, it's not just about the stories for young people, but there's,
about young people.
yes,
Yeah,
right, exactly.
yeah, right.
Hmm. So,
Um,
are you reading anything YA right now?
let's see. I'm rereading The Winter King, actually. I read it when it came out over Christmas. Greatly enjoyed it. I recently finished a series by Sarah Moss. The first book was A Court of Thorns and Roses, I believe, and I do not recommend it. It was heinous and terrible. I was very excited about it because it was pitched, the first book was pitched as like telling Beauty and the Beast mixed with a retelling of the Ballad of Tamlin. And I'm very excited about both of those things. And I was like, oh, maybe this one will be good. No, it was not. Don't read it.
I like how
uh,
you were careful to get the title right before saying,
yes,
"Don't read it."
don't read it. Yes. I finished that recently. I'm trying to think of any other things that I've been. I don't think that I've been reading any other YA stuff in particular. I do kind of try to keep on top of like what the best selling things are.
Hmm.
But again, sometimes if it just looks like it's going to be terrible, I won't bother, or I'll read like the first chapter and throw it against the wall.
Yes, yeah, I've actually had that experience with lots of YA stuff myself.
Yeah.
Alas.
Yes, unfortunately. Unfortunately.
Well, it's been really fun talking to you about all this stuff. I appreciate you stopping in. I've just moved into town,
Yes.
and I'm rearranging my library now, so I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, I've actually organized other people's libraries.
Oh, I know. That
That's
was
probably not something I should publicize.
that was the most interesting. Like that was, I keyed in on that on your profile on the Kepler site. So I encourage you guys to actually check out Mrs. Howell's profile on the Kepler website. It's in the description of the video you're watching. Um, and actually, so if you just hang on, Helen, you can stay on the
Yeah.
line. We'll say goodbye to everybody, and then we can chat afterwards.
Okay.
So long,
Sounds good.
everybody. Thanks so much for all your
Thank you
comments and
very
questions.
much.
Bye.